Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Paige Brody. I'm the Executive Director of the Springfield Public Forum, and we are very excited to be a co-host of tonight's event, co-hosting with the World Affairs Council, to welcome Mr. Hugo Restall to Springfield. And before I turn things over to my colleagues at the World Affairs Council, I do want to make a shameless plug for the Springfield Public Forum. We are just now announcing our fall 2013 season lineup of speakers. And if you didn't get one on the way in, there are some pamphlets on the table out front that actually have our preliminary schedule thus far. It has 3 of our speakers. And we are committing 2 more as we speak, so that schedule should be finalized pretty soon. And if you don't know a lot about us, I really encourage you to check out our website and keep checking back to that, because we bring some fantastic speakers to Springfield. We have our events just a couple blocks away over at Symphony Hall, and all of our events are free. So please invite a friend, come to any Springfield Public Forum event. You will not regret it, and we hope to see you there. In the meantime, I do want to turn things over to our colleagues at the World Affairs Council, who help make, really more than 50% help make tonight happen, let's be honest. Sid Melcher, the Executive Director, as well as President Gary Breton.
Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. I think I could say for the World Affairs Council what Paige just said, it's kind of a ditto. We've been around since 1926. Our mission is to provide education regarding global matters, intercultural affairs, and we're very, very pleased to have our guest speaker here tonight. I would also like to take a moment. One of the other things that I do in my life is I'm the chairman of the board of directors of Springfield Performing Arts Development Corporation, which operates Symphony Hall and City Stage. And I'd like to publicly thank Tina D'Agostino and her staff for allowing us to use this venue tonight. We're very, very pleased with the turnout, so thank you, Tina. I'm going to let Sid Melcher, our Executive Director, who, if any of you know Sid, does the bulk of the work. I just get up here and get to talk a little bit about our upcoming programs this fall. We hope that you're interested enough to attend. We have a lot of great instant issues luncheons that are held in downtown Springfield at the Sovereign Bank Building. And they're very well attended. We have some wonderful speakers. We do some evening events. And we're very, very, very pleased to be able to partner with the Springfield Public Forum to put this event on tonight. So on behalf of the World Affairs Council, thank you. And I'd like to introduce Paul Hetzel, who is the president of the Springfield Forum, who will introduce formally our guest speaker. Paul, thank you.
Good evening. It is really heartwarming to see this turnout for our inaugural and hopefully one of many cooperative ventures with the World Affairs Council. It's also nice to welcome a local talent back to Springfield to talk. And Hugo Restall is from Longmeadow, migrated north to go to college, where he's an Asian Studies major at Dartmouth, and then migrated a little bit west to China, where he studied Mandarin Chinese at Yunnan University. In 1994, he joined the Asian Journal as an editorial page writer and subsequently worked on the Deputy Editorial page editor. In addition, he also served as editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, a monthly journal of opinion analysis published in Hong Kong. In 2004, he became a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and presently serves as the journal's opinion editor in Asia. So let's give a warm Springfield welcome to Hugo Restall.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be back in the Connecticut River Valley and see so many familiar faces, although I can't actually see you with these lights. So I picked really an impossibly broad topic in the hopes that it would be provocative enough that it would lure some of you in. Now I have to deliver on that So I have to begin with some caveats, the normal caveats about talking about China, because pretty much anything you say about China will be true about some part of the country or at some period of time. With such an impossibly vast country, with really a lot of regional variation, and that's also changing so quickly, it's almost impossible to stay on top of what is happening in China, per se. Nevertheless, the country as a whole does have a certain coherence. There's a strong national identity, and I think it is possible to at least try to come to some understanding of what the current state of public affairs is in the country. To a large extent, I think the growth of the internet and modern communications and mass migration of people has made it more of a single country than it's ever been in its history. But of course, there are many difficulties. First of all, relating to its political system. Of course, it's a very opaque government and communist party sitting behind the government and above the government. And there's a tremendous problem of getting reliable statistics about the country. So when I drop various statistics on you, it will be perfectly possible to find some other statistics which say something at least significantly different, hopefully not the opposite. So you have to take everything that you read with a big grain of salt and be a critical consumer of information about China. Now, and I also should say that although I've chosen as my topic why Chinese are unhappy, there are a lot of reasons why Chinese should be happy. There has been really one of the world's greatest miracles of economic growth over the last 30-odd years since reforms began in 1979. One recent statistic from the World Bank is that between 1981 and 2010, the number of people in the world living in poverty went from 2 billion people down to 1.2 billion people. So a reduction in numbers of people living in poverty of 800 million in the world over that 30-year period. 680 million of that reduction was in China. So 85% of the poverty reduction in the world in the last 30 years has been in China. Not to say that other countries aren't doing well, but when we look at the overall picture of reducing poverty, it's largely about China. And how have they accomplished that? To a large degree, it's been the mobilization of labor, the people in the countryside who were, if not at subsistence levels, just barely above, and moving them into the cities where, although they may not be working at very high wage jobs, they may be totally unskilled jobs, they're still dramatically more productive than they were when they were living in the countryside. And there's also been the mobilization of capital. China was fortunate that when reform began, the people at that point, there was a demographic dividend. There was a very young population and a growing population. And those people, the families had saved quite a bit of money in the state banking system. And it also attracted foreign direct investment. So there was tremendous mobilization of capital to import new technology, and that created the growth that we see today. But I'm going to talk about what happens in the next stage. When you've mobilized the labor into the cities, and you've mobilized a certain amount of capital to provide the machine tools you need for those low-skilled jobs, you run into a problem of the next stage of growth, which is moving up the value chain, as the cliche has it, which really means developing your human capital, encouraging greater efficiency, and making those all stages of the corporations more efficient. And that's a much more difficult task than just mobilizing capital and labor. And it's also coming at a time when there are a lot of social problems, which is going to be the bulk of what I'll talk about. I also want to give you one caveat before I get into that, which is that whenever you talk about these problems, you will get pushback from some Chinese who, particularly a very nationalist segment of the population, who say that you're bashing China. And so I think I should respond to that at the outset. Whenever I am talking with mainland Chinese, typically the conversation begins with how well the country is doing, how proud they are of the way the government has managed this economic growth. And then as you bring up various problems, which are being discussed quite openly in the Chinese media, there's a turn in the conversation where they actually start to criticize the government more than you are. And I think this stems from the Chinese long-standing tendency to want to differentiate the message you give internally and externally. You know, you tell one thing to the foreigners, you present a good front to the rest of the world, and then you wash your dirty laundry at home. I think it's a universal tendency, but it's particularly strong. But once you get past that in the discussion, you find that a lot of Chinese, I think the majority, are extremely cynical about their government. In fact, they're willing to believe the absolute worst in any situation. So when there's some news about something that's gone wrong, you know, they'll instantly jump to the worst possible conclusion about what the causes are. And in some cases, they're right. I mean, we look at what happened with the Bo Xilai case, the Politburo member. I mean, there were rumors that there was an internal power struggle. Of course, the standard party line is that there's unity at the top levels of the party. And we found out that wasn't true. So we got a little bit of a peek behind the curtain in that incident. But there's a debate going on now about whether the system is broken, whether it's reached the limits of how far China can go with this growth model and with this political model. And that's being spoken about fairly openly. I mean, there's actually more freedom of speech than a lot of Americans realize. The difference is that you may be able to talk about it in certain fora, but you will not be able to sort of broadcast that message, or you may not be able to act on that message, which is the key distinction. But even the People's Daily has talked about a crisis of confidence in the Communist Party and the government. So up until now, social stability has been one of China's great advantages as compared to other developing economies. So foreign companies have been very comfortable coming into China because they're relatively confident that there will be social stability. It's become a virtuous cycle. As long as there's stability, the investment continues. But that cycle, of course, is not guaranteed. It can go into reverse. What's happening now in terms of the dissatisfaction in society is also coinciding with the economic slowdown due to what I was talking about of the difficulty of getting to the next stage of growth. China is now pretty solidly a middle-income country. It's around about $6,000 US per year per capita GDP. More if you use purchasing power parity. And those countries typically grow at about 7 to 8% in a good period, as opposed to the 11 or 12% growth that China has been used to in the sort of what I call the Goldilocks period of 2003 to 2008, where it was growing year after year at 11, 12, 13%. So with slower growth, fairness becomes more important in income. When things are growing very, very quickly and everybody's income is rising, There may be some dissatisfaction if your income is not rising as fast as other people's, but it becomes a lot more acute when the growth slows down. And China is now, its income level is around about where Japan was in the late 1960s and where South Korea and Taiwan were in the early 80s. And particularly Taiwan and South Korea, that should ring a bit of an alarm bell, because that's when the Gwangju massacre in South Korea, beginnings of unrest in Taiwan that led to the lifting of martial law in 1987. I'd like to talk a little bit about what I mean by happiness. This is sort of an emerging field at the moment, the study of happiness. These ideas are still being developed, but I think they're quite important for understanding social stability. One critical aspect of happiness is that your life is proceeding roughly in line with your expectations, or exceeding slightly. That's, I think, pretty easy to understand. And in China, there's rapidly rising expectations. But also, equally important, maybe even more important, is that you are rewarded for your effort. If you work hard and you're not rewarded, you'll have the feeling of being cheated. If you don't work hard and you're rewarded, you have the feeling of being a fraud, or you'll be resented by other people. So the key to a happy society is one that, by and large, effort is rewarded. And then there's the question of legitimacy of the socioeconomic system that you live in. Now, there are various kinds of legitimacy. Up until now, China's claim to legitimacy, the Communist Party's claim to legitimacy, has been the growth. It's performance. We've performed, and therefore we have the right to govern. Western democracies tend to rely more on process-oriented legitimacy, which is we have a democratic process, and that's what gives the system its legitimacy. We hope that it also performs, but if it doesn't perform, we then have the option of changing the government and putting new leaders in place. So how well is China doing in polling on happiness? There were some recent Pew polls which actually showed that Chinese were very happy with their government. I'm skeptical of this for the simple reason that if you go in and you simply ask people, are you happy with your government? By and large, you're going to get the answer yes. Just for the same reason as what I said when I'm talking to mainland Chinese, is at the start of the conversation, everything is great. And people don't know who is doing this polling. You know, it's better to err on the safe side. So the Gallup organization actually has been doing some polls where they tried to figure out a way to get around this and get a more accurate answer. And what they did was they asked people, were you happy yesterday? And I think that was a very clever way to do it, because if you're talking to a pollster and you don't know if they're from the government or whatever, you can say that you were unhappy yesterday. Could be for many different reasons. But you get a sample of X number of people on a particular day, whether they're happy. And the surprising thing was that of the 124 countries that they polled in 2011 using this methodology, China was at the bottom. It was 92nd out of 124 countries. And what was also very surprising to me was that only 12% of the Chinese people characterized themselves as thriving, that they thought they were doing really very well. So this is also reflected in some internal Chinese polls. There are some researchers, for instance, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who are doing these kinds of things. Tsinghua University, which is one of the top 2 universities in China, did a poll with a magazine called Xiaokang Magazine, in which they found that 40% of people were unhappy with their lives. And in the countryside, it was even much, much higher, 70%. The irony of that is Xiaokang Magazine. Xiaokang means basic level of prosperity. It was the official goal of China's development policy, was to get the whole country to Xiaokang, having enough to eat, some shelter. And now that they pretty much got there, they're finding out that that's not enough. And that goes against all of the policies since 1989, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, where the government's policies were essentially a social contract. If we deliver the growth, you don't meddle in the running of the country. And now we're finding that that contract does not hold true. Once people have Xiaokang, the basic prosperity, they want more. They're looking for development, individual development. They want to be treated with more dignity, and various other demands that I'll talk about. And this was discussed in de Tocqueville's book, The Old Regime. In the U.S. we tend to read his Democracy in America, but this is his other book, in which he came up with the thing that is now conventional wisdom, that authoritarian regimes are most vulnerable when they start to reform. And this book has now become a bestseller in China. In the last couple of years, the top leaders started to require it as required reading ahead of a party congress, for instance, last year. And the rest of the country has followed and started reading the book. So that seems to be the zeitgeist at the moment. Trying to understand what Chinese want, why they're unhappy. I think one of the key things, before we talk about specifics, is the arbitrary nature of government in China. So China is ruled by individuals, as opposed to what we are used to of rule by law, rule of law, I should say. Now, they're talking now about moving to rule by law, by which they mean the Communist Party will no longer allow officials to make arbitrary judgments on the spot. There will be laws that will actually be enforced, rather than sort of laws that are there to look good, but in any given case can be overruled. So the party lays down arbitrary rules, say like the one-child policy, but exceptions can always be made. And those exceptions are made on the basis of the individual official who's enforcing them, who he's friends with, his family, who's perhaps paying him a bribe, who he wants to influence to give him a favor, etc. These exceptions are not made as they would be in a society with rule of law, based on a process in which it's decided, say, that it's not in the public interest for it to be enforced in this case, say like a prosecutor deciding not to prosecute a crime in a given case. There would be somebody who's in a position to make an exception, but if they had a conflict of interest, they would have to recuse themselves, etc. In China, it's completely the opposite. It's the people making these exceptions to the rules make them by and large on the basis of their self-interest. In that kind of a society, everything becomes about gaming the system. And there's a saying in Chinese, 上有政策,下有对策, which is the people above have a policy and we have a strategy. So you can tell us what to do and we'll figure out the way to do what we want regardless. And this goes way back. I mean, this is not a recent phenomenon. I mean, you look at, say, the Cultural Revolution. They had these mass campaigns to exterminate sparrows or rats or mosquitoes. And what they'd do is they'd say to each household, you need to catch 5 rats by Sunday and turn them in. So what do people do? They start raising rats. If I have to have 5 rats by Sunday, I've got to start breeding rats. So that creates a tremendous amount of effort and creativity, frankly, that goes into dealing with the rules of the society. Perhaps getting around them with connections, but perhaps just finding another way. But that is tremendously destructive to the fabric of society. It erodes trust, and less obviously, it corrodes ethical systems, professional ethics, personal ethics. I'll give you a couple of examples. Professors in China recently have been incentivized to publish more articles in scholarly journals, which is not an unknown phenomenon. And of course, in the US, there are a lot of junk articles published just for the sake of filling up your resume. But in China, it's led to a surge in the number of plagiarism cases among professors, and quite senior professors, well-respected professors who are quite often not punished for this. The cases that you hear about are those where somebody has gone public with it and shamed them, and then perhaps the university will punish them for it. Universities as a whole have been told that they need to do better at placing their graduates in jobs. There's a problem with unemployment of recent college graduates. Universities are being judged on how many what percentage of their graduates are finding jobs. So the response of the universities has been to tell the students, until you can prove that you've got a job, you cannot graduate. It's a very simple response to the problem. So the students' response to this is to go out and find a company that will write up a fake certificate that this person has a job. So they present the fake certificate, and then the university files the fake numbers, and the student is still unemployed, and everyone will pretend that there's less of an employment problem. I think China, again and again, is proof of something that's known as Goodhart's law. I mean, it's not talked about much, but I think it's a fantastic law of social science, which is whenever some measure, say like the percentage of graduates from university that have jobs, whenever a measure is used as a target or to set policy, it ceases to be useful as a measure. It's essentially been corrupted by asking people to use it as a target. They change their behavior. It doesn't tell you as much about what you were initially trying to measure. I think that's true everywhere, but in China it's just ridiculously true. As with students and the diplomas, something can go from being an interesting measure of what's happening in society to telling you absolutely nothing. And the arbitrariness is pervasive. I mean, it affects groups of people, small and large, all over society. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's official discrimination against people who carry hepatitis virus. And so people who carry hepatitis cannot get jobs, cannot get into schools, essentially become non-people. Short people. There's often a minimum height requirement for jobs and universities. So what people resort to doing is having incredibly painful leg lengthening surgeries to take the bone apart, reassemble it, and then they're in a brace for several months, try to make their leg bones longer so that they can be tall enough to, to go to a good university. And that goes for handicapped people, minorities. A lot of the minorities cannot get a passport. If they come to Beijing, they can't stay in a hotel because there's a registration system, and they're considered to be risky to have in your hotel because the police will come and bother everybody. So tremendous amount of unfairness in the way these arbitrary rules are enforced, and you may be able to get around them, or you may have to live with them or find very costly ways of getting around them. So it fosters creativity, but not the right kind of creativity. And there's an interesting anecdote in the book called Mr. China, which came out about 10 years ago, about the experiences of a manager buying up companies, particularly auto parts companies, and trying to manage them. And they were buying state-owned companies where this culture was very deeply embedded. Either the managers of the company were completely lacking in entrepreneurial spirit. Essentially, they were state-owned enterprise people for life, and they didn't have to work, and they had no interest in making the company more profitable. Or they were too entrepreneurial. They wanted to not pay the taxes and rip off their suppliers and rip off their customers. So it wasn't a happy medium in terms of wanting to be entrepreneurial, but also wanting to treat your customers and your suppliers properly and behave ethically. At some level, this does have the potential to be turned around. You know, so some of these copies, for example, of the iPhone. In China, these are called shanzhai. Shanzhai literally means a mountain stronghold. And the idea was in the old days of very loose central authority, people would go up into the mountains and do what they wanted and live a free life. So people make a shanzhai iPhone. The problem is that although there may be a lot of creativity and innovation going into making that fake iPhone, which is not fooling anybody, by the way. I mean, people don't buy it thinking that it's a real iPhone. It actually, when Western companies talk about the amount that they've lost from piracy, I mean, in many cases, the people who are buying this shanzhai iPhone are not potential customers for a real iPhone because they can't afford it. The problem really is that they're not building their own brands. So they're putting all this effort into making something that looks like an iPhone but is actually a cheap phone, instead of creating a company that produces a really cool, cheap phone. And we see the lack of Chinese brands around the world. I mean, there are a few, but by and large, Chinese companies have been held back by this mentality. So, income inequality. Officially, China's Gini coefficient is about 0.47. 0.40 is considered usually the threshold for problems with social stability. Of course, I should explain, 0 is complete equality, and 1 would be complete inequality. One person earns all the money. But some university professors have calculated it as about 0.55, which is really quite scary, or even higher. I think when you look at Gini coefficients, it can be very deceiving because it's really the story behind the inequality that's more important. I mean, there can be inequality in a society, but if that's because a 21-year-old has invented Tumblr and has sold it for whatever billions of dollars, that's by and large a positive kind of inequality because we might feel jealous, but we shouldn't resent his success. But the problem is that the Chinese inequality is maybe even worse than the Gini number would suggest. to talk about that, you really have to talk about what's called financial repression, which is household incomes are suppressed in order to boost corporate incomes. When people talk about China's savings rate being so high, it's now over 50%, and it went to 50% really only in the last 12, 13 years. It was pretty stable at around 37% for quite some time, and then it jumped up to 50%. A lot of the story behind that, what happened in the last 10 years, is financial repression. That the incomes, savings that households were keeping in the banks earned such a miserably low rate of return. In fact, negative interest rate when you consider inflation. And that is used to subsidize companies that get loans. So the majority of the banking system is state-owned, and the politically well-connected or state-owned enterprises get practically unlimited credit at very low borrowing rates. So they can finance their expansion, borrowing at near zero real interest rates. And the people who pay for it are the ordinary households, who end up having to save more and more just to maintain their position as costs rise in society for health care and education and all the other things that they need to save for. So that really started to happen around 1990. It accelerated rapidly around 2000, but there was a turning point around 1990, and there's a professor at MIT named Yasheng Huang who has written about this quite extensively. And he believes that the decision was taken after 1989 that they could no longer simply open the market as they did in the 1980s and allow entrepreneurs to start companies and get rich. There was tremendous social mobility in the 1980s. There were farmers who started, a sunflower seed company and became multimillionaires and famous across the country. Quite a lot of these people. You don't see that as much anymore. By and large, the companies that grow to the size that they become nationally known have some sort of state connection. They may be owned by a city, a province, an organ of the national government. There's still quite a lot of entrepreneurialism, but these companies find it very difficult to borrow. They have to finance their expansion through their profits, just reinvest their profits. And then when they get to a certain size in a given business, let's say they're in machine tools in Xi'an, and they get to a certain size where the state-owned machine tool company in Xi'an is not happy. If they get any bigger, they're going to get squashed. So the entrepreneur who owns that machine tool company will stop investing the profits in expanding that factory, and he'll open a chain of travel agents. Something not in his core competency, but he can then start to build up his knowledge in that other industry until he gets to a certain size where he's competing with China Travel Service, and then he's got to start something else. So you have these conglomerates which are not very efficient, but more efficient than the state-owned enterprises. They can never push the state-owned enterprises out. And as you can imagine, that's not really very good for the efficiency of your economy. At the same time, in the post-1989 world, the party decided in the early 2000s that it would admit private entrepreneurs. So those few people who were leading entrepreneurs, let's turn them into state-owned enterprises, essentially. Let's bring them into the fold. In China, doing business is really always doing business with the government. The government is always your silent partner. Hear this again and again. Even if you're a private company, you have to be constantly taking out the local officials for karaoke, cultivating them, doing there's culture of entertainment, much like there is in Japan and South Korea and elsewhere. But it's really about taking care of the government officials. To succeed, you have to have these connections. If you don't already have them, you have to build them. And that, again, slows social mobility. And that brings us to, I think, one of the most obvious topics, which is corruption. So I won't belabor that point, just say there was a central bank report that was leaked in 2011, so it was quite interesting. Again, another peek behind the curtain, that $123.6 billion had been smuggled out of the country in the previous 15 years. And of course, that the amount that was smuggled out is a small fraction of the total corruption. We're mistrustful of our politicians, but the wealthiest 70 members of China's legislature are worth $89.8 billion. If you take the top 660 US officials from all three branches of government, so all Congress, the top cabinet officials, the Supreme Court justices, top 660 US officials together are only worth $7.5 billion. And I think you've probably seen the New York Times exposés of Wen Jiabao's family. Bloomberg did some excellent exposés of other leaders' families. And I think it's important to realize that this is not embezzled money. This is corruption in terms of abuse of power that allows businesses to be built. They will be the silent partner in a business, for example. They won't put any equity in. It's just their connections that they're providing to the company. And then when the company lists on the stock market, they make a large profit. I think the more interesting aspect of, let me know how I'm doing on time, by the way, if I'm okay, another 10, 15 minutes? Okay. The urbanization has a tremendous impact, and in ways that I don't think people always understand. Of course, in any society, when you have urbanization, you start to have problems of alienation. People come to the cities. They're initially quite happy to be living in the cities. But with the second generation, the third generation, if they're not moving up, if they don't have a sense of being able to have some mobility, it can cause a lot of problems. In China, there's other dimensions. There are whole villages in the countryside where the parents have moved to the cities to be workers in factories or on construction sites, and they've left their children in the village with their parents. So whole villages with just old people and children. And I'm very interested to see what effect this is going to have on the next generation. Some parents want to bring their children to the city with them, but there is a system of household registration in China called the Hugo system, which means if you are not an urban resident, if your residence is in the countryside, you can get on a train or a bus and come to the city, but you will not be entitled to any of the infrastructure of the city, schools, hospitals. Some of them set up illegal schools for their children, and the authorities then close them down. Property prices have risen tremendously in China, even though there's been a housing boom. And I get asked a lot, is there a housing bubble in China? And I think there's not really a single housing bubble per se. But what's really striking is that there's so much spending on building luxury housing and so little spending on providing working class housing. And that's because the profits for developers are so much higher for the luxury apartments. And a lot of these apartments are empty. The state electricity company estimated there were 65 million homes in which there had not been any electricity used in the last 6 months. So there are all these apartments sitting empty. They were bought as investments. They're large, luxurious apartments, but a shortage of working class housing. So if that luxury housing is a bubble and it were to burst, it would still be very difficult to adapt that housing for working class families. And that's just a symptom of the unfairness in society, I think, that even wealthy people are unhappy with this system, because when their business is generating cash, they have nowhere to put it. If they put it in the bank, they earn a negative rate of return. They can try to move it offshore illegally. China has capital control, so you're not supposedly allowed to move large amounts of money abroad. Stock market has been controlled. It's essentially a funding vehicle for state-owned enterprises. IPOs are pretty strictly regulated because there are fears that if they allowed too many good companies to list, the stocks of the state-owned enterprises would fall. So those aren't really very appealing. I mean, there are periodic speculative bubbles, where the market gets ramped up, but over the long run, it hasn't really gone anywhere. So where do you put your money? You put it into buying more apartments. And because up until now there's been no property tax, it's cost-free. You can let the apartment sit there. You can put it in different people's names. That's essentially legal. I mean, there's no enforcement of a real name registration system. So you can put your apartments in your relatives' names, your friend's name, your mistress's name, which is a whole other topic. Another thing that doesn't get as much attention as I think it should is the amount of stress that urban Chinese feel they're under. One aspect of the single-child policy, which I think has been covered to death, is that these children are spoiled. They have 2 parents and they have 4 grandparents all buying them things. Very true, but when they grow up, all that flips around, and suddenly they have to support, their own and their spouse's parents. So there's one couple supporting 2 retired couples. And there's very high expectations on them. All this money has been invested in their education. If they graduate from college and work in Starbucks, it's a big problem, especially if the families are from the countryside. They may have borrowed the money to pay for the university. Another topic that's been, I think, covered pretty well is the environment, and urban residents are obviously very upset about this. They can't trust the food, they can't breathe the air. There's fakery of all kinds, like the Shanghai iPhone. There's, Shanghai eggs. For example, you wouldn't believe that you could fake a chicken egg, but there are eggs that are completely fake. So inside there's a white and a yolk, but it's all oil-based, concoctions. And there's just a general lack of trust in the cities. A lack of dignity and high-handedness from officials, culture of impunity among officials that is making even the winners of reform. I'd say the urban residents are the people who in the reform era were the winners. Conditions in the cities were much, much better than the countryside. They got health insurance in the last 10 years or so. The education, a lot of the spending on the education goes to the urban residents. Little known fact of the exam to get into universities is that urban residents only need to get a lower score in order to get into any given university. If you're from the countryside, you need to score much higher in order to go to a good university. So, as I mentioned, the wealthy are not happy with the system. They're moving their money abroad. Various surveys from banks show that 30 to 50% of the wealthy, defined as having several million US, have either already acquired a foreign passport or are in the process of doing so. A lot of people, officials, have moved their family abroad while they stay in the country and make money. And if you're rich in China, you need to keep a low profile. There's something called the curse of the rich list. Forbes does a China rich list, and there's another organization that does a rich list. And year after year, several people in the top 10 in the year after they're on the list will be arrested for corruption or shaken down in one form or another. So you definitely don't want to be on the rich list. You want to keep your money secret, keep a low profile. Yeah, I'll just gloss over a couple of other problems. I mean, if you're a rural resident, you have the problem of land. You don't have clear title to your land. So if you're a farmer in a village, the land may be redistributed every 7 years, depending on who's still in the village. If people have moved out, they lose their land. And then if you're on the edge of a city and they want the local authorities want to sell your land to a developer, you don't really own that land. The village as a whole may get some compensation, but you don't get any windfall profits from that increase in the value of the land. Healthcare is minimal in the countryside. I think it's important to mention another very large disadvantaged group, which is women. One of the few things that I would really give China credit for in the Mao era was when they said, women hold up half the sky. Of course, women did not, by and large, make it into the higher echelons of leadership, but they were fully admitted as members of society and expected to work, and there was childcare in the work units, et cetera. That has gone completely backward. It's not only the problem of providing the health care, but the child care, but just societal attitudes, discrimination. I mean, there was a recent survey in the last 2 or 3 weeks which found that 52% of men admitted that they had sexually assaulted women. I mean, it's epidemic. And the suicide rate among women is the highest in the world. I think in some part that's due to the fact that in the countryside, both men and women, if they try to commit suicide, they tend to do it by drinking insecticide, which is unfortunately a very effective method. And that pushes up the rate. But still, the suicide rate among women is really shocking. So to conclude, I mean, where is this leading? There's a researcher named Sun Liping, very well respected, who's continued to estimate the number of mass protests in the country, even though the government has stopped releasing these statistics because they're so alarming. There were 8,700 what's called mass protests, which is over 25 people or so, in 1993. That increased tenfold over the next 12 years, 87,000 in 2005, and now Sun Liping estimates 180,000 in 2010. What's really surprising to me is that Chinese, up until now, have continued to believe that their local leaders may be corrupt, but the leaders at the national level are really on their side. And if only we could, bring our plight to the ears of Xi Jinping or the Premier Li Keqiang, he would redress this. He would see how terrible this is. And people come to Beijing to go to this petitioning office where they're allowed to drop off petitions, of which a minuscule number are ever acted upon. What I think is happening at the moment is that people are starting to lose faith in the central government. And it's taken a long time, and there's I think the internet has played a large role. But what really alarms me is that if that faith is lost, then there really is a tinderbox which is waiting to be ignited. So I'll stop there, and there were several other political reform, internet and media, and the current generation of leaders, which I didn't get to discuss, but I'll be happy to address those in questions if you're interested in those. Back there. Okay, well, I think what you're always not supposed to do is make a specific prediction and a date. So I'll make a prediction, but I won't say when it's going to happen. But I think the new leadership is going to try to reinvigorate economic reform, which had been largely stalled for the last 12 years. But it seems like they're also going to continue the policy of the last 12 years of more and more crackdowns, continuing to be very tough on any form of dissent and censoring the internet, et cetera. So in a sense, I think it's although some positive things will happen on the economic front that might make it easier for the private sector, all those things I was talking about of entrepreneurialism being stifled, that might be helpful. But by and large, they're doubling down on, we provide the growth and you don't meddle in the politics. And so I think that there are also some economic problems coming down the pike, not just the slowing growth, but there's a buildup of problems in the banking system, which I don't think is necessarily going to be a crisis per se, but it's going to require a lot of attention and it is going to be a big distraction for the party. So I think they are facing some more serious unrest, looking into, say, roughly the next 5 to 10 years. Another aspect of why things are getting tougher for China at the moment is that the demographic dividend, the young population that they had in 1980 has now largely disappeared. The new workers, sort of in the 20 to 24-year-old bracket, they're usually the ones that the factories in Guangdong need to attract. That age cohort is now starting to shrink. It's peaked. So it's becoming more difficult. The factories are having to move inland to find enough workers. Some of those people are not as willing to come down to the coast, so they need to move the factories to them. So wages will be rising. That puts a heavier burden on prosperity. I'm not too concerned. You asked about the imbalance, the sex imbalance. I'm not too concerned about that. Largely because in any urbanizing society, there always seems to be more women looking for husbands. It's in American cities as well, but in China, that's all anybody's talking about is all the leftover women who can't find husbands. So, considering that outside of China, we where are these 30 million girl babies, and men are not going to be able to find husbands, and they're going to become violent, and crime will go up. And meanwhile, in China, they're talking about exactly the opposite. So, yes, that problem will get worse, and maybe there will be we'll be talking about men not being able to find wives in 10 years or so, but that doesn't seem to happen. Oh, great. Well, a lot of these social problems that he identifies in the book as having led to the French Revolution are, very nicely paralleled in China today. So I think people in China enjoy reading it and having that sense of recognition that this is exactly what we're going through. We're, urbanizing. We now have a real bourgeoisie, and the ruling class is behaving exactly like the French monarchy. So I think it's obviously the Communist Party. The interesting question is, why are they reading it, and what message are they getting from it? And one message they seem to be getting from it is, do not start to liberalize, because when you do, it's all over. So that's what I say again. They're doubling down on the social control mechanisms. Now, for the last 3 years running, the budget for police and social control in general has exceeded the military budget. Well, I guess the real indicator is how people vote with their feet. And if families that have money will send their kids to the States, because the education system is still very rote learning oriented, is what they call it, the stuffed duck system, which is you just cram the food down the mouth of the duck, or you cram the information into the minds of the students. And then at the end, you have somebody who can recite a lot of facts, but may not be a very effective, scientist in terms of discovering anything new. So they're generally not very happy with their education system, although they're proud of, say the high school students, scoring the highest in the world. I think the Shanghai students scored the highest in the world on the math recently. But I think there's a very keen understanding of the limitations to that system. I mean, the real reason they have that test-based system is to deal with the corruption. It's at least have a somewhat meritocratic system. If you have an exam, and whoever scores highest on the exam will get into the universities. But of course, there are ways that the politically well-connected families get their kids in, and then, as I said, the rural students have to score higher. So it's not really a very meritocratic system as a whole. Yeah, so the question was, are the different classes of people, say in rural areas, are they aware of the problems that others face? And so is there a sort of a basis for perhaps organizing? Is that what you're getting at? I think increasingly there is. I mean, the problem is, there's always this debate about technological determinism. Will the internet make China free? And I think that's really the wrong way of looking at it, that any particular technology will make China free. But what happens is that every technology that comes along, there is a period a window where it actually has a very interesting effect. And then the Chinese government figures out how to deal with it. So we saw this with blogs in the early 2000s. There were several cases where blogs had a huge impact. And then the government figured out how to influence the bloggers and modulate the censorship. Same thing happened after 2008 with the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. Had a big impact in 2011. The last couple of years, much less impact. And what typically happens, they use this strategy in all contexts, but including the protests in the streets, is let people blow off some steam, let them complain, then after a certain period of time, close it all down, don't allow any follow-up, maybe arrest some of the leaders who were organizing the protests, and go on from there. So that's what they use with every technology. But what I think will be interesting is if there is a crisis at some point and it coincides with some new technology which they haven't yet figured out how to control, then you have the potential for something really interesting to happen. Like in 1989 with the fax machine was the new thing then, and the students in Tiananmen Square were using fax machines and the government didn't know what to do about it. So it's not a question of how powerful the technology is, it's timing and whether the government figured it out. So this gentleman up here had. So the question was about the one-child policy. So it actually started in 1980, 79, 80. it's now to the point where people in the cities don't want to have a second child. And I think they've actually, there's a lot of talk and debate in China that they've left it too late to relax the policy. They should have already relaxed it. And that when they do relax it, they're not going to still not going to have enough children to, get back up to replacement level when they thought they would. So the population continued to grow, after 1980 because there was a bulge in the population with then having their single child. But now the population is I think, close to peaking, and certainly in the working age population is peaking. They're looking at the same situation as Singapore, which did exactly the same thing, trying to discourage people from having children, and now they're desperately trying to get people to have babies. So I'm sure China will do the same thing. Sure. This guy. Yeah, and I think the question was about how these domestic problems influence foreign policy. So we're still in very early days with a new leadership, which has just taken over. But one of the key slogans, the two key slogans, is Chinese Dream, which is left, I guess, somewhat intentionally vague. But by and large, it seems to mean a strong China and national rejuvenation, which has been an ongoing theme. But the new administration has made these two things their key slogans. And it seems like what they're trying to do is, if the growth is not going to be the primary pillar of their legitimacy, they may need to rely more on nationalism. But how far that will go is really hard to say at this point, because it is a new set of leaders. The real turning points seem to be around 2008, 2009, during the financial crisis, and that's worrying. That their response to a very sharp slowdown when trade from the U.S. and Europe fell off a cliff was to immediately start picking a lot of fights: Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, India, all at once. And if there was a domestically caused economic slowdown, would they do that even more? Is a real worrying question. Sure, lady up here. Well, so if you move 250 million, 300 million people into the cities, that's, even if they're in very low-skilled jobs assembling things, that's a tremendous amount of trade that's generated by that. What you also need to look at is how much of the value of the products that we count as coming from China were actually made in China. So something is on the back of a computer, it may say made in China, but all the components came from Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and it was assembled in China. So on our trade books, it looks like lots of stuff coming from China. But from China's point of view, we imported $80 billion worth of stuff and then did some things to it and then exported it for $90 billion. It's a very small amount that they're actually adding. I should also say that they've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs too. I mean, around 1999, 2000, tens of millions of people were laid off from factories in the Northeast as they restructured those. So, around the world, manufacturing, there will be less and less people working in manufacturing, and more people working in services. And China is affected by this as well. I mean, they may temporarily, tool up to do these things, but a lot of them are now moving out. The textile factories in Guangdong are moving to Bangladesh and Vietnam, sneaker factories. It's just a constant migration. Yes, and if you look at the amount of money that they own in treasuries, The government has bought all these treasuries, US Treasury bonds. What they've used to buy that is money that they've borrowed from their own banking system. And I don't think people really realize that when they talk about that. It's often, people say, well, why don't they use all that money that they have in treasuries to do things back in China? Well, in order to accumulate that, they took money out of their banking system in China. You know, it was essentially they were trying to keep the value of the yuan stable. So on their balance sheet, they don't have this huge, amount of treasuries. They have treasuries balanced by debt in renminbi. Okay. So the question was, what is life like in Hong Kong? How is Hong Kong doing? Has it lost its financial center edge to Shanghai? That's something that people were worrying about 5-10 years ago, and not so much anymore. Shanghai, until the yuan is convertible, Shanghai doesn't really have that much hope of being an international financial center. And until they change this system of financial repression that I was talking about, it doesn't really have a chance to become a vibrant domestic center either. So, if China ever gets to be the prosperity level of Japan, Shanghai may be like Tokyo. Tokyo is, sometimes considered an international financial center, but it's really just a center for, domestic finance. And it's a function of the closed system. So with Hong Kong, since the Hanover, I get asked that a lot. It's changing incrementally. There's a new chief executive. They're trying to use some of the same methods of social control that they use in the mainland, but the resistance from the Hong Kong people is fierce, and and they are demanding that the Chinese government fulfill the promises of at least a limited form of democracy should start in 2017. If it doesn't, if they don't fulfill that promise, there's going to be serious protests in Hong Kong. Hong Kong people are, I think, proudly Chinese, but have a very distinct identity. And there was a lot of talk: will Hong Kong become the model for the rest of China? It doesn't seem like it up until now, but there is that. Increasingly, seems like there is that possibility as Hong Kong people resist the fake milk powder and all the other things, the fake food coming down from China, and sort of express the things that people in China wish that they could express.
How about a round of applause for our guest speaker?